I'm going to cover some basic sewing operations using this hoodie as an example. So in our 2D window on the right side, you see we have half of the patterns we need for a full hoodie. We first need to copy all of these patterns to complete the garment. And I want to make this as a symmetric copy. So what I'm going to do is select all of them just by clicking and dragging a marquee selection box around all of the pieces using my transform pattern tool. That's our basic tool up here for selection. Once these are selected, I have two ways I can do this. I can right click and go up to symmetric pattern with sewing, and you'll see this is under clone pattern with linked editing. That's grayed out, but these are the options regarding cloning your pattern underneath. We want this first one with sewing. So I can do that, or you can see the hotkey right next to it is Command D. So I can click that, or Command D will also do that same function. You'll get this new set of pattern pieces, and I'm just going to click to place them in my workspace. And it's a good habit to get into right off the bat that you are keeping your patterns organized so everything makes sense together. And I'm also centering everything in the roundabout correct area around the silhouette of the avatar. And this is really beneficial. It not only makes sense when you look at the pieces together, but you can tell how the garment's going to fit when you are drafting a pattern or editing it. So we need to sew this together and also arrange the pattern pieces on the avatar. You can do either step first, but I like to arrange the pattern pieces first. So again, we need to select everything, and I'm just doing that so I can get these out of the way. I want them fully out of the way of the avatar so I can then place the pieces two at a time. And I say two at a time because they are symmetric. When I place one, the other symmetric piece will follow. To get our arrangement points, we can press Shift F, or up in the vertical toggle menu, we have a button right here. In the avatar display menu, the second one is the button for arrangement points. So Shift F or that button. Now when I select, either in the 3D window or 2D window, I can select each piece and find the appropriate position for it. Click on the spot when you see the ghosted outline of the pattern in the correct area, and the other one followed. So I can go to the back and notice this one. If I click on this one, I know it's my wearer's right side. So I'm going to go to my wearer's right side to place it. Now we can do the sleeves. This is on my wearer's right side. So there's the right sleeve. This is colliding a little bit with the shoulder, so I'm just going to raise it up a tiny bit. The other one looks fine. Next, I'll place the hoodie, or the hood, I should say. This is the wearer's left side. And I'm just going to put that right on this profile, the only dot on the profile of the head. And these pieces, the smaller rectangle, that's the cuff for the sleeve, and the longer rectangle is the waistband. So I'm not going to place either of these small pieces, or actually all three of these, the cuff, waistband, and the pouch pocket, I'm going to use a different function to place those rather than the arrangement points. So at this point, I can turn the arrangement points off. So Shift F. And you can see here on the front, I have some internal lines. The default color for internal lines is red. I've changed mine in the user settings to pink, but just know that this is the internal line that you see over here on the 2D window. We have to sew this pocket to the front of our hoodie, and that's why that internal line shape is on there, because otherwise we would have nothing to sew to. And if that doesn't make sense right now, it will in a couple of seconds. So we have two tools here. Up in the top right corner of our 2D toolbar, we have our sewing tools, our edit sewing, segment sewing, free sewing. Remember, segment sewing is just for simple segments, meaning there's no segment point within that segment. It's just a single segment. So this will work for a lot of these pieces. For instance, the hoodie, or the hood of the hoodie, that's a simple segment, so I can just click once, left click, and click, and our sewing relation is applied. And we can do this for the shoulder. So if we have the wearer's right side, and notice how my tick mark is on the side closest to center front. It's at HPS, toward HPS. So if that is my wearer's right side, I need to be on the wearer's right side for the back shoulder, which is this piece over here. And I also need to make sure that my tick mark is on the side that's closest to HPS, or the center. So it would be clicking once again over here, and that establishes our shoulder seam. And because these are symmetric, it applied it to both shoulders. So that's easy enough. That does a little bit of the work for us. Let's see what other simple segments we have. I can go ahead and stitch the center back seam together, even though we wouldn't have a seam typically in a hoodie. We would just merge those two pieces, but for now we'll just stitch it. So I just used my segment sewing, and I clicked once on this segment and clicked once on that segment. That's our center back seam. We can do the same for center front. So let's close up center front real quick. One click and one click. So I'm going to move over to the free sewing tool. And we just want our regular free sewing, just like we were using our regular segment sewing tool. This one, not our multiple to one. We want to use the regular free sewing tool. And we couldn't use the segment sewing tool because, for instance, if we wanted to sew the underseam of our sleeve real quick, we can't use free sewing on this because there's a segment point interrupting this segment. So I'm just going to use free sewing by clicking once at the start, clicking once at the stop, and same for the other side. One click and one click. And that allows you to pass up any segment point. So both of our underseams for our sleeve are sewn together now. Be sure that you aren't sewing additional sewing relations. You don't want to have double stitching going on. That can get confusing. It might prevent you from doing that. It might give you a message saying there's already a stitch sewing relation. So let's do our side seams now. We've already established that this front and back are both for the wearer's right side, so I know that this side seam goes together. Click and click, and that gets both of them for us. That's great. So before we get into this a little more complicated sewing with the neckline and the hood and the sleeve into the armholes, I'm going to stitch the cuff to the end of the sleeve. And yep, that is a shorter segment. This cuff segment is much shorter than the sleeve opening, but it will feed it into it. It will distribute it evenly in there for us, so that's exactly what we want. And I'm also going to stitch our pouch pocket onto our front. Yeah, I might have trouble with this. I'm going to Command Z. I already established my first sewing relation right there, so I'm going to undo that. Command Z. Remember that we have unlimited Command Z. You can undo as many times as you want. So let's do this with a incremental step. So I'm just using my free sewing tool still, and I just clicked once and clicked once. I'm going to do the same for this. And I'm also going to do this top area. This is the opening of our pouch pocket, so we don't want to stitch that down. But we do want to stitch this to the center front and waist of our front panel. And because we have these stitches, these sewing relations applied, we can use the superimpose function now. So real quick, I'm going to go back to my transform pattern tool, which is A, hotkey A. And I can now click in the 3D window, select this, right click and say superimpose over. And so I could also just bring that closer to where I need it, right? And shimmy it up real close till it is close enough where I need it, but superimpose is so much quicker. So that would be a hassle getting this cuff over to the sleeve opening, and the cuff would remain flat. But when I superimpose, it is going to listen to what the sewing relation is, and it will curve it around with the sleeve. So one more thing before I say superimpose, we did a specific superimpose with the pouch pocket. We did superimpose over because this layer of the pocket is laying on top of the front panel of our hoodie. So that makes sense, superimpose over. With the cuff, it's going right beside the sleeve opening. So we want to say superimpose side. So that is now on the end of our sleeve opening. We can do that with the other cuff. We'll just right click and say superimpose side. And we need to stitch the waistbands to the waist of the hoodie, and we'll superimpose that on the side as well. So I'll get my free sewing tool again, and I'm going to apply this waistband with this side and this side as the center front. So what I'm going to do, I have two options here. I can sew this entire space right here, this entire segment, by clicking once, and then holding shift and doing the front and the back panel, or I can stitch this once and stitch this once, and then do the same for the back. So you can do it separately, you can break it into two, this being for the front of the hoodie and this being for the back of the hoodie. Otherwise, I'm just going to do this all in one. So I'll left click, and now I'll hold shift while I click, and click. So we were traveling from center front to the side seam, to the side seam, to the center back. That's what that waistband needs. That did the other side for us, so that's great. And while we're still in this free sewing tool, we'll do the armholes and the sleeve cap. So this is the same situation. I could do this in single increments, break it up. This segment sews to this, and then this segment sews to this, or I can do it in one. So here's our front at our underseam all the way to the back of our underseam. If I want to do this in one go, which is good to, this is a good way or method to use if you have ease in the cap and you don't have the correct segment point, breaking it up. So I would start from the front, clicking once and then clicking again to stop at the back. Then I would hold shift and get the second part of my sewing relation. So all the way at the underarm, click once, click again, still holding shift, and continue over to my back panel at the shoulder seam, click once and click again. All the meanwhile I was holding shift to get that double, get those two selections within that second part of my sewing relation. And real quick, when I did that, so I clicked once and clicked again to stop, and when I started to do the actual armhole, the second part of the sewing relation, so I'm holding shift, click, and then click right here, you see where that blue dot shows up. That is telling us if you want a completely even sewing relation, meaning that the first segment is one length and then your second segment you chose is the exact same length, then stop at the blue dot that they suggest. But we don't want that because our sleeve cap has ease in it, and that ease is going to be worked into the actual armhole. You also notice that the numbers underneath my sewing tool right there, they don't get any bigger when I zoom in, but you can see the discrepancy of the sewing relation. So it tells us it's off by 0.78 inches. Our first sewing relation was 16.66, and our second sewing part of our sewing relation is 15.88. So that's pretty handy to know how much you're off. Okay, so that sewing relation is set, and that did the other one for us. Last thing we need to do is the neckline and the hood. And this is the exact same situation, although we don't have a segment point breaking up the neckline of the hood. So we have to do this in one fell swoop. We don't have a choice here. So I'm going to click once at the front of the hood and then click once at the back of the hood. And this is our wearer's right side, so I need to work with the wearer's right side neckline. And since we started at the front and ended at the back, I'm going to do the same for our wearer's right side. I already did our first sewing relation, first side of our sewing relation. I'm going to hold shift now, click once at center front, click again at the shoulder seam, come over to the back panel of our right side and click once at the shoulder seam and then again at center back. So that has applied all of our stitching. Our construction is done here, except one last thing. So we need to close up our cuffs. So I'm going to stitch up that, and we need to close up our waistband. So this is the center back right here. Click and click. And we also need this center front closed. We would probably have like a zipper right here or something, but there are plenty of hoodies with no zippers on center front. So let's finish finding the position for these two waistband pieces. I'm going to go back to my transform pattern tool, this tool right here. I can either click this or press A, hotkey A, and I'm going to right click on one of these and say superimpose side, because it's not going over the piece, it's going right next to it. Do the same for the other piece. Right click, superimpose side. And what are these that we have left? Huh. I'm not sure what those are. It might be my It could just be my computer being weird, like my GPU or my CPU. Oh, that's really weird. So let's Command Z to get out of that, whatever we did. Everything is still sewn together. I can see if my sewing relations are still there if I go to my edit sewing tool at the top here. And anything that has a random color assigned to it tells you that there's a sewing relation. Now let's try superimposing these waistbands again. So superimpose side, and superimpose side. Yeah, super weird. I'm Commanding Z again. Let me just try to bring those over. So normally that superimpose works perfectly fine, but every once in a while I get some sort of glitchy thing happening and you just gotta undo it and either choose a different way or try again. And sometimes you have to start your computer over. So this doesn't take too long, but it's definitely longer than just choosing superimpose. And now we have straight pieces that will be a little bit harder for simulation to get settled, but that's fine. We'll just give it the best chance we can. Okay, before we simulate, I want to make sure all of my stitching is good. So one, I'm going to see if my stitching is going through the avatar in a really bad way. So right here at the shoulder, I can see it's going through the shoulder. It will likely be fine if I simulate right here, but if I wanted to give it a little bit easier time trying to simulate, I would just move these panels up slightly so I'm missing the shoulder there. And there is some crossing, or it like visually looks like some of the stitches are crossing, which usually tells us there's a mix-up of the direction that we made our sewing relation, but it's just because this isn't wrapping around yet. I'm going to bring these out just a little bit because they're overlapping each other. And you probably do not have to do this little bit of making sure everything is good. I'm just being extra vigilant with it. This one is a little bit too close. And to make sure your stitching relations are all proper and in the right direction, I'm going to hide my avatar. So Shift A, or you can go up to the vertical toggle menu, and the first button is for the avatar itself. And when we do that, we can see a little better what's happening with the stitching. So I want everything to look straight, like it makes sense where it's going, nothing's twisted around, and everything looks good. So let's go ahead and simulate and bring back the avatar, Shift A. So we can simulate by pressing this arrow or spacebar. And it's stuck on her hair. That sometimes happens. So we just give it a little tug and it usually works out. Okay, that is a little bit of some basic sewing. Remember, if you have an issue, I'm going to stop simulation real quick. If you have an issue with your sewing, let's say we have a backwards sewing relation, like our tick mark is on the end of the shoulder for one side versus the other. If you need to undo any sewing or reverse it, go to your Edit Sewing tool, the first one at the top of your toolbar in the 2D window. Right-click on that sewing relation, and here are your options: reverse sewing, delete sewing. This is getting into some other stuff. And deactivate sewing only if you need to specifically deactivate a certain seam or sewing relation. But these two are the ones that you would be using most: reverse sewing and delete sewing if you make a sewing mistake. Or just Command Z will usually fix a lot. And that is basic sewing.